Hello and welcome to the Election Corner on One Man Think Tank. It's Christmas Eve, and I just want to knock off the Georgia votes, because we've had some updates there, and let me say, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas for the Democrats if these numbers are going to hold as they did in the general election. Now, still, early votes are up compared to what they were in 2020. I'm going to inherently go back to the last election in my mind, which will be 2016. If you hear me saying 2016, I mean 2020, the general election. We're talking about the 2020 runoff. I'll try and do general and runoff. Now, very good news. The number has dropped to 7% difference between turnout for the general and turnout for the runoff. That is very, very good to hear for the Democrats. Because, for one thing, high turnout usually benefits the Democrats. However, this time around, it's going to be a little bit more favorable to the Republicans due to the red nature of the state, especially its rural areas. However, we've got some very interesting news. First off, just looking at the breakdown of the votes, the black vote is still up compared to what it was in for the general election. I nearly said 2016 again. And that is incredibly good for the Democrats. I believe for the general election, the early vote total for African Americans was 28%. Now it's still around 31.5, 32, 30-ish. It keeps alternating every time we get some votes in. And that is amazing. I cannot emphasize how amazing that is for the Democrats, because those are almost guaranteed to be votes into their category. Also, we're starting to see the youth voting begin to turn out. But the lower than 50 cohort, the group that voted for Democrats across the board in Georgia, has now made up about a third of the vote and is looking to begin to gain in important areas. Not to mention, there is good reason to believe that the over 65s here are a solid chunk of them are African Americans, which is, again, very good for the Democrats. Women are also still representing the majority of the vote. Again, all these demographics are good for the Democrats. But let's look at the really important part here. 65,000 non-voters, people who did not vote in the general election and are now voting in the runoff. There is good reason to believe a majority of these voters are voting for the Democrats, and these votes skew to the Democratic Party, partially due to high new voter registration, the fact these voters are skewing quite heavily African American and educated urban white, which are also Democratic categories, and the fact that they are stupendously young out of the whole bunch. There are some older voters, but mostly stupendously young. All of these add up to very good news for the Democrats, especially when this race is going to come down, unless something crazy happens, to a few thousand votes. I'm calling it now. It's going to come down to a few thousand votes in both races, and it's going to take a while to figure out who won. Well, we'll probably know on Election Day who won, but it'll take a while for all the lawsuits and things to finish out. But already we're seeing great news for the Democrats. And most of the people who are voting early are people who voted early in the election. So these demographics skewed towards the Democrats. So these are looking more like urban whites than rural whites. Urban educated whites, specifically, who vote more Democratic. Day of votes broke mostly towards the Democrats. However, mostly towards the Republicans. However, look how many day of voters are African American, and this group still, on election day, skewed heavily towards the Democrats. Same with Hispanic and Asian. They haven't overtaken the white amount here, but that is enough to really limit any gains they can get. We're looking at the GOP needing day of voters, whether it's day of in the runoff or day off in the general or day off in the runoff. They need to get I believe, between 55 and 65% of the vote, depending on how the early votes are breaking down. In the best case scenario for the Democrats, Republicans are going to need like 65% of day of voters to vote for the Republicans, which is really bad for them, because they did not get that in the general. Or, in the worst case scenario, only about 50%, which is genuinely doable. They could super win that. But I also want to take a look at the county level, because this is another part that's going to be real damning for the Republicans here in a moment. Let's go to counties by registered voters. Look at that. Fulton County, 56%. Gwinnett, 50%. DeKalb, 56%. Cobb, 47%. Clatham, 45%. All these high turnout suburban Democratic counties, which are giving us, especially counties like, I believe Clayton is one of them. I do not know Georgia as well as I should on the county breakdown, but I think it's counties like Clayton and Cobb that are going to be giving us a lot of those suburban white votes, and they are definitely giving us suburban white votes. But across the board, we're seeing high turnout. But as you can see, high turnout in these smaller areas is not as great of an effect as in... So, for example, here, total number of votes, if I can get the right column right. Yeah, votes. So total number of votes given so far in many of these small counties are in the thousands. And that's going to add up to something. No argument there. However, when you factor in that it takes a lot of small counties to counter out Fulton, especially since those guys are at their 60s and you're only at about 50 there, the higher the turnout, the better the scenario for the Democrats. We've also been seeing a lot of proof that many of these rural areas are turning out a lot of rural black voters as well, which really help the Democrats. So, you know what? I'm not calling the race by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're looking at these numbers and aren't saying the Democrats have a strong fighting chance, got some bad news for you. You're wrong. So, with all that being said, if you like the video, drop a like and a comment down below. If you want to hear more from the channel, click the subscribe button and the notification bell to be alerted when new content is released. If you want to hear more from me outside of YouTube, I have a Twitter, @OneManThinkTan1, the Roman numeral, link in the description below. And as always, and most importantly, have a wonderful day and a happy holidays.